So Tyrannid's points changes are weird, there's a strange neglect of any balance going on for flyers, and plenty of factions seem to be on Horde mode now. Let's talk about some weirdness and letdowns from the 40k big update. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought we'd talk through a few areas which Games Workshop maybe should have done better in the balance patch. Broadly speaking, I would say that the balance dataslate and points updates broadly got the game in a better shape. 40k balance both within factions and between them was in a particularly bad state before this. Certainly enormously worse than it was throughout the second half of 9th edition. I think to their credit, Games Workshop generally have made some fairly big swings and given a good nudge for most armies in the right direction, either down towards the middle of the pack for the top stuff, or given points or rules boost out to some of the most struggling armies. Obviously things are still going to be very far from perfect, particularly for some factions, but broadly speaking, the things that are behind now won't be quite as badly behind as they were, and the same for the things at the top being not quite so far ahead. Plus there were plenty of changes to internal balance as well, lots of very bad units that got points cuts, and a few changes to the core rules that I thought were broadly sensible. Despite this though, I thought I'd just talk about a few major criticisms of the changes that they've decided to make. Just a few things that are maybe slight missteps, or a bit conspicuous by their absence, going over the update as a whole, both in terms of points changes, core rules changes, and faction rules. First up, one thing that I particularly noticed that seemed to be very absent from rebalancing were any changes to flyers and fortifications. For the most part, any of these things in these couple of unit classes have broadly been just entirely neglected for the armies that needed rebalancing. Seems that for this update, Games Workshop just wasn't really particularly interested in even trying to get them right. I feel like trying to make flyers relevant but not overpowered is something that they've often struggled with in the past. I feel like they are a unit that typically either tends to be massively dominant or just kind of meaningless. Say for example, for the horrors of Eldari flyer spam in 8th edition, or the repeated patches to flyers in 9th edition to limit how many you could take, with Admech and Orcs being the main problems there. The 10th core rules for flyers maybe don't make this too easy as well, I think. They don't have the same restrictions on them that they had in 9th edition, with only limited amounts being able to be taken. In theory, you could have Orcs taking 12 flyers, or Admech taking 9 or something. They often tend to be a class that's best in large numbers if they're good at all, and perhaps partly to stop that being the case, Games Workshop makes the core flyer rules fairly weak for 10th. If you want to start on the board turn 1, then your movement gets significantly limited for the flyers that have hover, and many of them can't even take that option, have to go into reserve, turn up turn 2, have locked flight paths, and in particular the rules for bomber type aircraft out there are basically broken and not in a good way. It is maybe just a little bit weird that they decided to make almost no attempt to try and balance these. The vast majority of factions with flyers have tended to have them passed over for any sort of points rebalancing. There are a few exceptions for armies like the Admech, and the same goes for fortifications for the most part. Say for example the Death Guard basically had their entire index drop in cost, but not their miasmic malignifier. Orcs are maybe a good example of that as well. The Orc flyers are just notoriously terrible in 10th edition, the bombers more so than the shooting ones, and despite being pretty well accepted as some of the worst units in the index, they've basically been left completely untouched. I think it would be really quite cool if Games Workshops could somehow find out a way of making flyers into a bit of a sweet spot. I think they don't really want them dominating army lists, but just to have it where maybe one or two might make sense as a utility option, but aren't so good they dominate army lists or lead to massive alpha or beta strikes. Another common talking point that's happened since the points cuts are that for a few of the armies that have taken the greatest points cuts towards the bottom end of the 40k meta, it might well have helped them out a fair bit in terms of in-game power. But at the same time, you're going to start creating armies that are very, very hoardy, with requiring a whole ton of models to put on the table. And it's particularly strange for more elite armies, like say Death Guard maybe, where they're supposedly really quite elite and dangerous Plague Marines. They now only cost 16 points per model, some of the cheapest Space Marines around. The same goes for their Terminators to some extent. Points cuts definitely do make units and armies better. If you drop them in points, they'll get better relative to the rest, but it can start to change the overall feel of the army. And while being able to take more stuff is fun, I feel like in general there's a bit of an acceptable limit that people have, and how many models they really expect to play with as part of their army. It could be annoying if, say, you've got an established 2000 point army list for Adeptus Mechanicus or Death Guard or something, and all of a sudden the points cost come out and you're short around about 300 points or something. I feel like some people were perhaps hoping that they might go a little bit heavier on the special rules or altering their core rules to make the units in the army better overall, while not necessarily having to cost them dirt cheap. It does have its disadvantages as well, adds to the rule bloat in Warhammer 40k. Some people might prefer the one or the other. As mentioned, I feel like Death Guard and Admech are some of the best examples. For the Admech, it kind of feels like they might be heading back generally towards the dirt cheap Skitarii hordes that they had going on in 9th edition. It's a bit funny seeing fully upgraded Vanguard at just 80 points with all their special weapons and things. And they do have really quite a lot of small skirmishing type units that really don't cost many points at all, but cost really quite a lot in terms of money. Units like the Taraxi or the Sincarians or the Sindonian Dragoons might be good examples. Black Templars also seem to be feeling this as well. 12 points for their Firstborn and 14 points for their Primaris Crusaders both seem really quite strange, just massively cheaper than any other Space Marines out there, and you can put a ridiculous amount of them on the table. Votan and Tau might be two examples of armies as well that have got significantly less elites due to the enormous points cuts. Overall, I'd say that points definitely do work well for rebalancing armies, but it feels like for Admech in particular, who maybe don't seem to have gained a whole load of power from the drops, you would need to reduce their points to truly quite bizarre levels, and then their army will be even more ridiculously expensive to collect. It's already expensive at the moment. Next up, I thought it would be worth mentioning the Tyranids points cuts, something that I did talk about in the Tyranids points changes video that I made earlier in the week. But in terms of actual changes that Games Workshop made that were generally seen as quite bad, these really did feel like they missed the mark on a whole load of units. The timing for it was perhaps particularly unhelpful, midway between the official reveal dates for reviews for the codex and the codex actually coming out so people can play with them, and somehow between the two of those the points all change. I think that might have rattled people a little bit anyway, even if the changes had all been very sensible, but a few of them are very weird indeed. Hive Tyrants and the Swarm Lord both went up 20 points compared with where they'd been before, and both of those fell foul of the stratagem limitations where you can't modify stratagems that aren't battle tactics. The Swarm Lord in particular wasn't that common a sight in competitive lists, at least not compared with the Walking Hive Tyrants. The Tyrannofex as well also saw a very strange nerf going up to 245 points, despite having its durability decrease in the codex. It lost its -1 damage rule for a single cancel an attack type rule. It looked like it had gone down in the codex to compensate for that, so just boosting it all the way back up to 245 points seemed so strange. Otherwise, there's a bunch of units that look like they've been changed very slightly for the better in the codex: the Harpy, the Sporicist, and the Hive Guard. And then Games Workshop's digital points updates put them back up to levels where you'd never really want to play them. All of those just felt like kind of needless nerfs to units that wouldn't be particularly exciting even at the much lower points costs that the codex brought. I would still say that Tyranids definitely have some strong units and options with the new codex. Lots of monsters remain very efficient, and in particular I quite like all the new Lictor rules. I think that they'll be great. But I feel like some of the changes they made seem to go directly against internal balance, which is kind of a shame as they've broadly been fairly on the money with the units that needed to get buffed for that for other armies. One thing that maybe surprised me a little bit with the update as well is that we still don't really have any FAQ document for Warhammer 40k, something they have often generally done in the past for basic questions as to how an army might work. It looks like their philosophy in 10th edition seems to be that kind of poorly named designer's commentary document is actually the errata document for the core rules, and it does make a number of changes to the rules and also governs all sorts of different edge cases that are perhaps left out of the main bulk of the text just for brevity. Still though, as I've talked about in the past on the channel, I feel like there are a few basic questions that they could probably just do with answering with an FAQ. I'm kind of surprised that they didn't take the opportunity to at this point, as they often publish these sort of things around the balance update kind of time. There are quite a few things that could do with some sort of FAQ or errata, but maybe these are some of the main offenders. The Tau for the greater good rule still has the debate about whether it can chain or not. From my read of it, I'd say that it's very unlikely to be the intention of it to me. The bit about working in pairs implies that one unit guides another, and you don't just have a daisy chain of every Tau unit guiding the next one. But I feel like it is fairly ambiguous the way that the rule is written, and I have seen it argued fairly extensively both ways, to the point where I think it definitely needs an FAQ. Another really obvious one is that with all the talk of extra stratagems and things, they didn't touch on the ones that allow you to do Overwatch an extra time in a phase. There's a fair few units that specifically say that you can fire Overwatch one time, even if you fired it somewhere else in your army that same phase, but don't actually have anything to override the actual text on the stratagem itself that says that you can only use it once per turn full stop. The intention of those rules certainly seems clear that you can use it more than once, otherwise those rules just wouldn't literally be in the game at all. But rules as written, they don't technically work, and I feel like that's something that Games Workshop really should get on. They've definitely had enough time to have feedback from that. Finally, for some of the more major things, I feel like the ignores modifiers versus damage reduction could probably use a little bit more explaining. Some of the design commentary does talk about it, but maybe in a little bit of a peripheral way. Again, that seems like the thing that could be very easily wrapped up by an FAQ. For the actual meat of the balance update, with army overall power levels, it's still obviously very early days at the moment, and it's not like we have any tournament data to back this up at all. But from most people's initial reads of where the points have landed the units versus where they were before, it still feels like Eldaria are clearly going to be at the top and 40K's best faction, where general consensus seems to be that they just didn't really go far enough on armies like Sisters and Admech in particular. Perhaps Drukhari, Votan, and Astra Militarum also look like they're going to be trailing the pack quite significantly. I think the nerfs for Eldari very solidly pushed them back towards the middle of 40k. Games Workshop did take just about every one of their tournament staples and raised in points somewhere around the 10 to 20% mark, plus toned down Phantasm but still kept it viable for infantry, and had changes to Overwatch and Devastating Wounds, all of which hit Eldari a bit more than most factions. Still though, even with all of those changes, I think most people's initial thoughts were that it just doesn't really look like enough compared with the other armies. In terms of the power and the scale of the nerf, it felt broadly in line with what they gave to the other 5 or 6 top factions of Warhammer 40k, despite being ridiculously massively ahead of the vast majority of those. Games Workshop came down hard on armies like Thousand Sons, Adeptus Custodes, and Imperial Knights in particular, and Eldari were winning around about 70% of games when they were around about the mid to low 50s. In general, most of their good units still seemed pretty good, and there were quite a lot of units that just weren't touched whatsoever, and I feel like they were perhaps kind of concealed with being pretty good choices just due to everything else being taken more commonly in tournaments. The very first tournament results do seem to be in line with this as well. Out of the 3 big tournaments of the last weekend, Eldari won 2 of them despite the nerfs. Otherwise, the other armies do seem to be towards the lower end still, despite buffs. Admech still maybe don't have a lot more teeth than before, though we'll be putting some more models on the board. Sisters are still going to have big issues killing tanks, and quite a lot of their units just still don't really do enough damage for how fragile they are, given that they might often be one-hit wonders. Drukhari did get some nice cuts, but maybe taken the edge off with the Ravager nerf, which was a solid nerf to their best unit, not what a kind of underperforming faction needed. It looks like that one was toned down due to it being played in Inari probably, and it kind of remains to be seen where the leagues of Votan and the Imperial Guard will land. They did have some helpful stuff go down, but Votan started from literally the worst position in the game, and Guard got some nerfs to Sentinels and Manticores. Finally, and maybe just highlighting one thing from the core rules changes, is that in Games Workshop's drive to fix devastating wounds for Eldari with not having things like the Wraith Cannons or the D Cannons overspill to kill entire hordes of models. By turning them into a mechanic that isn't mortal wounds anymore, they have, as maybe a slightly unintentional knock-on effect, nerfed quite a lot of abilities that protected against mortal wounds. Quite a few units in the game have some sort of feel no pain type save that triggers against mortal wounds only, and devastating wounds were by far the most common source of mortal wounds. Everything else is maybe a little bit peripheral for the most part. You don't tend to get that many armies that just deal direct mortal wound damage and nothing else. Perhaps the one army that might suffer the most from that are the Custodes. I think it's maybe not too surprising that Games Workshop wanted to rein them in a bit, and they have done things like limit squad sizes and increase points costs. But I think now for quite a lot of armies it's going to feel like they're basically playing without a detachment rule. The one that gives them a 4+ save against mortal wounds might come up occasionally, but now devastating wounds are going to go straight through their armour, which I don't really think was the core intention of why Games Workshop made that change. It's also another stealth nerf to a few other things out there, things like Terminator Chaplains, Tower Broadsides, or the Norn Emissary. It's not necessarily saying that these units are just outright bad overall. Broadsides are still definitely fine for their raw firepower, and the Norn Emissary is tanky and gets a feel no pain on objectives anyway. But in general, anything that gave you a save against mortal wounds and you were getting some good value from it is now going to be a lot more niche. Obviously, I'm not trying to blow anything out of proportion here. I still do think that the majority of changes that they made were really quite good indeed. Even if with the state that Warhammer 40k was in to start with, it is probably going to take more than just one update before most armies get within Games Workshop's target range they like to aim for, 45% to 55% wins. Let me know your thoughts though. Which areas did you like, and which areas do you think they messed up on? Look forward to hearing your thoughts and feedback down in the comments as always. If you've enjoyed the video and you'd like to see more like this, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.